So here we go, Chapter 9, Part 1, Patient Assessment, Scene Size Up. Now we break our patient assessment down into different blocks of what we're doing. And we always start with scene size up because that's what keeps us from becoming patients. Patient assessment and specifically speaking, the scene size up. So the beginning steps of all this are what makes us take a look around and figure out and make sure that we're not walking into something that first and foremost we don't have any business walking into as EMTs working in an ambulance. You know, I'm not sure how your all days is going to be broken up when you get out to the fire service, but speaking from strictly the emergency medical technician side of it, my uniform wasn't fireproof. My uniform wasn't bulletproof. So things that have to do with stuff that's actively on fire or being shot at didn't really require my attention until those two things were fixed. The scene size up is what's going to keep you safe. And then a little bit later on today, when we get into the primary assessment portion of this, those are all the things that are going to keep our patient viable. Those are all the things that we're going to look at and figure out anything that is immediately threatening to my patient's life. The scene size up is to make sure that not only am I not in undue danger for no reason, but also to start moving the wheels and putting the pieces in play to start maybe fixing some of those problems, like making sure if I need any additional resources, I ask for them. You know, start to get a look at, do I have too many patients and do I need to have some more ambulances started over this direction so that we can sort of get out in front of this and wind up on the good side of things. Your scene size up starts before you ever exit your vehicle. Now, this picture, and I don't know what they were thinking, but this picture here drives me nuts every single time I do this lecture. Because what are we doing right here? Somebody tell me what this EMT is doing.
She's putting herself in danger. And
Yeah,
her
how
crew.
come?
Well, she's hanging out the window with binoculars. I mean,
Next to, and we can tell that she's trying to get a look at this tank, right?
yep,
That's what, 500, 1,000 gallons
probably
of
explosive.
stuff, of something that's clearly placarded. And, you know, if I was that concerned with something that I thought was going to blow up, I don't know that I would be parking probably less than 100 yards away from it. You know, your scene size up isn't just, you know, make sure that I don't step out the door of the ambulance and get hit in the head with a shovel. Your scene size up, especially, you know, as we're talking about fluid environment and motor vehicle collisions and things like that, you start looking at what's going on around you as you're approaching. You know, is traffic going every which way but straight? And we're going to be out here trying to play Frogger if uh, we get out of the truck or even park the truck here. You know, start to look at things as you approach. As you're approaching a scene, do you see anything? Do you smell anything? Do you hear anything? You know, if you're driving through the city of Everett and as you're approaching whatever it is that you're headed to, you notice entire blocks of a neighborhood are without power. Well, that tells me somebody probably hit a telephone pole and I ought to make sure that I'm not getting out of the truck and stepping my dumb behind onto a live wire. So it's all in sort of that windshield survey and making sure that as we're approaching, we're not getting in over our head. The full elements of our scene size up is checking for scene safety. Scene safety is one of those things that is also part of our whole fluid look at things. The only time that a scene is 100% safe or a call is 100% made safe is when you've dropped that patient off and you are sitting in your ambulance, not moving, getting ready to clear with dispatch. That's it. That's the only time where things aren't subject to change and scene type safety issues could pop up. Because what I can tell you about having worked with law enforcement, EMS, And now in this aspect of my job, working with a lot of the local fire departments, we don't leave people in the field, right? So if I do something dumb and walk myself into something unsafe, either on purpose or by mistake, what I know about the people that are coming behind me is they'll hang their necks out trying to get me out of there. So now not only have I made myself another patient, I have also put other people in harm's way, and I have also created a much larger scale negative on the situation that we were dealing with in the first place. And the minute we as providers start being in the negative column on some of this stuff, we are rapidly pushing this whole incident towards spinning and spiraling out of control. And most of the time, once that whole chaos theory starts, you never get on the right side of it again, and it just snowballs and things get just crazy. The next part of our scene size up is going to be that standard precautions, our body substance isolation. So PPE, we're going to make sure that we at a bare minimum on every single call. Now, this is not thinking in terms of COVID because the rules have changed a little bit, but the bare minimum on every single call is going to be a pair of gloves when you're in contact with the patient. That is definitely one of those do as I say, not as I do type situations, because I'm a jerk. I'll sit here and tell you guys until I'm blue in the face, you should always have gloves on, always have gloves on, always have gloves on. And then if you saw me providing care in the field, I'd probably almost never have a pair of gloves on, but that's because I'm an idiot. The only way to fully protect yourself from all the nasty, creepy crawlies that are out there is not to touch them, not to have them introduced to your person. So standard precautions really means wear whatever layer of protection is dictated by the call. You know, if you're showing up to somewhere that you know has had people with tuberculosis or COVID, now we go from just needing to wear our gloves to needing some respiratory protection, some eye protection, some protection to keep all of that crud off of our clothing. So that's when you start seeing us wearing like those plastic gowns and things like that, just to make sure that first and foremost, I keep that stuff off of me right now. And secondly, I keep that stuff off of me as the day passes along, because if I carry it with me on my uniform, it's always going to be on me for the day. If it's always on me for the day, I have more of a chance of spreading it to me. I have more of a chance of spreading it to my coworkers, and I'm going to have more of a chance of spreading it to whatever other patient I come into contact with. So standard precautions are one of those things that as the level of sickness or type of sickness sort of works its way up the ladder, we start wearing a little bit more PPE. You notice at this point, we're starting to talk about mechanism of injury, nature of the illness, but we really haven't even gotten first look at our patient, because we're still evaluating the sights and sounds. We are really just still sightseeing at this point. You know, it's one of those like, oh, as I'm approaching the house, do I see an overturned ladder in the front yard, right? Well, yes, it was a fall, but nobody told me it was a fall off the roof. So it starts to now give me a little bit of an idea of what I can start to predict for injury patterns, and, you know, getting a 1,000-foot view of what's going on. Nature of the patient's illness, a lot of times we'll get that from our dispatch information. You know, dispatch information isn't always 100% spot on. You know, when we get to the patient's side, they may, you know, we may get dispatched for a chest pain, but when we get to a patient's side, we're there chest pain, and there's a piece of lumber stuck in our patient's chest. Well, those two things have much different treatment modalities, much different ideas of the where's, what's, why's, and how's. When I initially got dispatched for chest pain, I was thinking cardiac or maybe respiratory. But now I'm thinking penetrating trauma to the chest I switch gears pretty quickly at that point. Determining the number of patients is always, always, always important. We need to make sure that we have enough hands on scene to care for the amount of people we have in front of us. Truth be told, one patient at a time, really, unless, things have really gotten wild. Especially if we have one really sick patient. And a critically ill or injured patient is going to take all of your focus and all of your attention, and there's really no two ways about that. So the minute you have one critically ill patient and one only sort of ill or injured patient, you have too many patients. So that's where we decide that we need some additional resources, whether it's more ambulances, another fire company, another set of police officers, because there's a large crowd that needs to be sort of dispersed and gotten off our backs, or something even simpler than that. You need the light department to come and shut off a power line before you can get to your patient. You need the gas department because there might be a leak and, the scene is clearly unsafe if the building might explode. This is something to keep in your back pocket for your entire career. The only predictable things about emergencies is they are unpredictable and can pose many dangers. There's no such thing as an emergency that is, run of the mill. This is not just your run to the store for milk and bread. If we're out on an emergency call, it is anything and everything. The rules really don't apply. Anything can happen, will happen, and does happen. And, you may have gone to this same address 1,000 times and the patient is always, nothing wrongitis. You can never find anything wrong with them. They go to the emergency room and the emergency room never finds anything wrong with them and they get discharged before you get back in quarters. It happens. But then the 1,001st time that you wind up at this patient's address, they are filled to the apexes of their lungs with fluid and in respiratory failure, and you have to ventilate and you have to get a medic to come and maybe intubate the patient, and all sorts of things are happening and all the wheels are in motion. But I'm sure when you left quarters to go to this address for the 1,001st time, you figured, oh, we're off to Hank's again. He just wants to go to the CHA in Everett for a turkey sandwich and some conversation. We have to always go in with a fresh set of eyes and a fresh view of whatever is going on, whether we're talking about assessing the scene and making sure that the scene is safe and things are going to go our way when we get there, or when we're talking about assessing the patient and making sure we don't miss the little things when it's, the same people all day, every day. So why don't you guys tell me, what do you think are some potential threats to providers at an EMS scene? What do you think are some things that can be threats to safety?
I guess a wide variety. It depends on what kind of scene you're on. Like if there's a shooting, I know there's, scenes that firefighters and EMFs has been shot at before. So if it's a shooting and the police haven't secured the area, there's a chance it could get shot at.
Sure. So I'm going to follow that up with a question then, since we started right out of the gate with violence. And I mean, that should be on the forefront of your mind, because as providers, we are and have been and probably will continue to be, targets for violent acts. Do we have any business being there in the first place?
No.
We don't.
If it's not secure, then no.
Yeah, this isn't, tactical emergency combat care. We're not going to be providing care to people under fire and, ducking and dodging bullets. That's not what really our piece and our role in all this is. Until the scene is good for us to enter and good for us to enter without the thought or idea of a bullet could hit any second, we probably stay in our truck staged up the street until called for by PD, because their piece of this emergency service is to address, contact, and contain that threat. Our piece is to care for all the fallout. And that's sort of where the division and the dividing line lives. There's nothing wrong with staging up the road and waiting for the scene to be cleared, because you're not going to be able to provide any care while, gunfire is erupting all around you anyway. It's just not a thing. What else? What are some other things?
Flammable objects, or potentially going into a house of a patient and not knowing that there's a crazy dog that could bite you at any time.
And that's actually a big one. One of the very last things that the EMD cards tell us to tell the caller when we're on a call in the 911 center is we give them a list of instructions. And one of them is, if there's any dogs in the house, please put them away somewhere. Now, I have a black lab. He's as dumb as the day is long, and he's just a friendly dope. I mean, he's just, nothing going on between his ears. He is too stupid to be mean. But what I can also tell you is he loves my wife a lot. So if an ambulance crew was in my house trying to work on my wife or start an IV or do something, he'd be trying to take a bite out of crime at that point, because he would have no part of all these perfect strangers in his house trying to mess with his mom. Even the nicest dogs do not like when all this commotion is going on and we're on scene sort of futzing around with their owners. So as you're walking in, you start to see signs that there's a dog around. Always ask, always ask, because getting bit by a dog sucks. It's not really a good time. That's sort of one of the little known ones, right? That's not something you think of. You figure, oh, I like dogs. Dogs like me. Me too, and me too. But it's something we have to pay attention to. And really everything is something we have to pay attention to. So what do we do if we get on scene and things kind of deteriorate a little bit and it turns into kind of a mess and things become unsafe? What's our responsibility there?
Safety of yourself and safety of your crew.
Yep, bail. That's what our responsibility is there. There's no saying that you can't leave and come back. There's no reason to leave yourself hanging out in the breeze in situations that you can honestly say have become unmanageable. Just a year or two ago, we had locally a Boston EMS provider who had been patted down by PD, stabbed an EMT in the back of a Boston EMS vehicle. This was a seasoned professional. Even when things appear to have been done correctly, we have to stay on our toes, because if you look at the back of an ambulance, you are never really more than what, like maybe 36 inches away from your patient. We don't know these people from a hole in the wall. And regardless of how capable you are in self-defense and defensive tactics that you've taken in previous lives and all of that stuff, you know what's going to happen if somebody's 3 feet away from you and wants to stab you? You're going to get stabbed. It's just a fact of the matter. Our position in all of this, first and foremost, isn't to be anybody's punching bag, but it's also not to be involved in the wrestling and restraint and arrest of people, because right out of the gate, until that is subdued and under control, that's not our part of this. And that's just my little piece. The state of Massachusetts used to pay me a whole awful lot of money to roll around with people on the floor of your local friendly correctional institute. That's not my job here anymore, and I don't have to do it anymore. So you know what? I'll let the people who do wear the bulletproof and stab-proof equipment knock themselves right out. I'll be waiting over here when you're done pepper spraying and arresting this fella. Bring him on out, and we'll take care of things from there. So some things to consider when we're talking about scene safety. As we're approaching the scene, remember I told you it starts outside. As we're approaching, look and listen for other emergency units. There are videos upon videos upon videos online, if you care to look, of police cars crashing into each other headed to the same place, ambulances crashing into police cars, ambulances and fire engines crashing into each other. It is unbelievable how often we get in each other's ways. And not to mention the fact, if you're not looking around and paying attention, somebody might pop out of the door of an engine or a cruiser or another ambulance, and we could mow them right down on our way to whatever emergency scene it is that we're looking for. So keep your eyes peeled. If we're headed to a motor vehicle collision, look for that sign of some form of power outage like I talked about. Start to observe the traffic flow. Start looking for smoke in the direction that you're headed. So smoke near the collision scene. Most of the time when these things get called in, people call in initially the motor vehicle collision. Sometimes it takes a minute for a car to really get cooking and give off any flame or any smoke. So the first responding units, first due in, might actually be the first people that see that sign that something's burning. As we're getting up to our scene, look for any signs or things that direct you towards possible escape of any hazardous materials. You know, if it's a motor vehicle collision with a tanker or anything like that, we can start looking as we're approaching. The ambulance should have binoculars, should have a NIOSH guide in it so that you can look at these placards and identify what is actually in that vehicle, because it's a whole bunch different when it's a milk truck versus when it's a truck hauling fuel. You know, we have a whole different ball game when something might explode. Start looking for collision victims near the roadway. For the most part, vehicles are designed these days with all sorts of crumple zones and impact zones, and they are meant to crush and collapse upon themselves like an accordion. It's not like, you know, the old days where you had these great big giant land barges that weighed 2.5 tons made out of the finest steel in Detroit, and there'd be a tiny looking accident and dead people in the vehicle. Now we see vehicles that are all smashed up and totally demolished, and the people are out walking around taking selfies and posting on Facebook about it. So people get out and start wandering around before they realize they're injured or realize that they don't feel well, and have a tendency to sort of wander their way into traffic, be walking along the side of the road. Just be alert. Still looking for smoke, still looking for downed utility poles and wires. We want to make sure that we're not getting out and getting involved in that, because there's no real way to tell whether the wire is still live, so treat it like it is and stay away from it. You can't outrun electricity. Look for other emergency responders on scene. If somebody has beaten you there, they have already gotten a pretty good idea of the wheres and what fors, and they will generally direct you where to park your ambulance so that you will be close to your patient, out of the way, and best of all, able to leave the scene. Because once we have our patient treated, packaged, and are ready to go, it's time to just leave. We can't be blocked in by cruisers and fire engines and all sorts of other responding emergency apparatus. as we arrive on scene, especially now we're talking a little bit large scale here when we talk about following instructions of the incident commander, but also there's going to be some form of officer type person from your fire department generally on scene telling you where to put the trucks and where to park things and where to stage and where to set up, because they're there using their experience, using their wealth of knowledge to make these decisions and try and not have this whole incident turn into a circus. Probably a good idea to follow what they're telling you to do. We don our appropriate personal protective equipment as we're getting out. Most of the time lately, now we're looking like this when we go into people's houses. With the exception of that mask, we would be wearing an N95 HEPA mask because we are treating everybody like they are a biohazard. If you treat every patient like they are contagious in some form or fashion, you'll never get anything disgusting on you, because you will go out of your way to make sure that wet and sticky and not belonging to you stays off of you. If there is some sort of hazard, we're going to establish a danger zone. We're going to evaluate the area and try and see if within reason we can figure out what that hazard is and how far away from it we need to be. Different hazards obviously require a different sort of zone of containment. But really, as far as I'm concerned, if I think it's a hazardous material problem, I'm going to stay quite far away from it, because you're not going to have hazmat type stuff in your ambulance. You're not going to probably, I don't imagine, have all of your typical normal firefighting gear, because there's just not going to be room for it. You won't be necessarily involved in the going in and retrieval of patients from the hot zone, because once you put a contaminated patient in your ambulance, what is that ambulance?
Contaminated.
And what are you?
Contaminated.
Absolutely. So, you know, it's different hats for different days, really, right? Because there are some times where maybe you are on that hazmat piece of it, because that's your day on the engine. That's your day on the ladder. But when you're on the ambulance, your job, your piece of the action is care and transport of patients. And if we take and contaminate the inside of our ambulance with whatever hazardous material it is, and contaminate our person with whatever hazardous material it happens to be, then we're turning ourselves into a negative on the situation again. When we talk about different types of hazards, you always want to stay upwind, so have the wind at your back blowing towards the scene, and you always want to stay uphill. We don't want wind blowing all this hazardous crap on top of us, and we don't want gravity allowing things to run downhill into us. So uphill and upwind. When we get to the scene and we start talking about evaluation of what is going on around us as far as people, look for and listen for fighting and loud voices, obvious signs of weapons, drugs and alcohol, unusual silence. That to me is probably the one, like these things are supposed to be chaotic. People are always, oh my God, come, you gotta help. And, you know, waving you down as you're pulling in, and somebody's meeting you outside telling you, come on, hurry, 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 they're sick. When you get there and it's like tumbleweeds and you can't hardly find anybody, nobody wants to talk, it's really sort of a tense type situation. Start looking around and paying attention to what it is that's going on around you. And the last on this list is probably the biggest indicator that something bad might happen. Something bad happened here and with this person in the past. The past is a great predictor of the present and the future. So if you know that the address or the person you're dealing with has a history and a tendency to be violent, have a very short trigger for, you know what, we're gonna go. If you don't want to calm down, we're leaving, and this will go different ways. And you just go back, get in your truck, toddle off down the block a little bit and wait for the scene to calm down a little bit. Wait for the scene to be managed appropriately with the people whose job it is to provide public safety. So, mechanism of injury. Mechanism of injury, simply put, is how did this person become hurt? Nature of the illness is a bit more different, a bit more difficult sometimes, because people don't always know what they're supposed to say to the dispatcher. People don't always know the answers to the questions that we're asking them. And last but not least, and the most confounding portion of it all, patients don't read the book, so they don't have any idea how they're supposed to present to us. Not every single medical malady that we're going to cover is going to present in the exact same way. You know, we pepper these people and ask a lot of questions, and there are a lot of pointed questions trying to get the best information out of them that we can. But there's going to be a lot of times you're talking to a patient trying to evaluate the nature of their illness and assess their medical complaint. And the best they're going to be able to give you is, I just don't feel well. Well, that's not a whole hell of a lot of help, but we do have some other things that we can look at and stuff that we can do, you know, taking their vital signs, looking at their skin color, temperature, and condition, start working through their medical history a little bit and trying to check off, you know, which is most likely, and start looking at those to see if this is what's making your patient have this totally broad, non-specific complaint. Other times you're going to ask the patient what's going on, trying to figure out their nature of illness, and they're going to point to the left side of their sternum and say, I have this terrible crushing 10 out of 10 substernal chest pain. It feels like there is an elephant sitting on my chest. And you go, well, the fact that this patient might be having a cardiac event just jumped up and slapped me around a little bit. And I probably start looking into that some. Mechanism of injury is simple. Simple why? Because we're looking at the forces that actually caused that patient to become injured. We will talk a little bit about being able to look at the way a vehicle collision has happened, look at the way a patient has sustained their injuries, and predict their injury patterns. Things like falls, you know, somebody falls from height, off a ladder, off a roof, out of a tree, and they land flat on their feet. We don't just see injuries to just the point of impact. We don't just see injuries to those lower extremities, because all of that force and all of that gravity gets transferred up through the body. It's going to continue to transfer until it's just all completely dissipated. So we'll see injuries to hips, knees, lower back, thoracic spine. We'll see actual vertebral fractures from somebody who never really landed on or injured their back, just because that pressure wave of energy being transferred into their person has now gone through their entire body on the way to working itself out. So when we look at things like head-on motor vehicle collisions like this, whether someone was restrained or not is going to help us predict the different kinds of injury patterns. Whether someone was wearing their restraint appropriately or not will tell us how to predict some sort of injury patterns. And let's have a look at our driver in this picture right here. What's something you can see right out of the way? Should this car have an airbag?
Yes,
Does it look like that airbag has deployed?
definitely not.
Yeah, I don't think so either. So on the scene safety tip, that airbag is still loaded and still has every opportunity in the world to deploy until made safe. I have a friend who missed that on his scene size up once upon a time and stuck his head in somebody's car and went to cut their seatbelt because they were unresponsive like this guy right here, and the airbag went off. Not 3 inches from the side of his head. And what he tells me about that day that he can remember is he woke up and was screaming at the roof of his ambulance. He was on a backboard in his ambulance being transported, and he was knocked out so fast he didn't even have a chance to scream. So pay attention. When we're looking at motor vehicle collision as a whole, take a look at the windshield, take a look at the steering wheel. In order, obviously, to have created that spider web pattern in the windshield, we know that it was most likely the patient's squash that hit the windshield and caused that spider web pattern. Now, windshields don't just break with, a stiff breeze. So it takes a lot of force and is likely to have caused a lot of injury with this up and over injury pattern for an unrestrained passenger or an unrestrained driver. The driver has an extra added little tidbit of hitting the steering wheel when he comes up out of his seat and forward up over onto the dash. So we'll have head injuries, we'll have injuries to the chest, we may have lung injury, injury to the heart. This up and over injury pattern, we could see lower leg injuries. So we're talking now, we're getting to the lower extremities. Why would those be injured on somebody who comes up and kisses the windshield?
The
Except
legs get
for-
cramped.
Say it again.
The legs get cramped, like underneath the steering wheel.
Yeah, the legs are going to hit whatever the patient is still moving forward. So objects in motion stay in motion until acted upon by a force. That force is going to be the head hitting the windshield, the chest hitting the steering wheel, and the legs hitting the dashboard. Steering wheels will break your legs if you're traveling fast enough and you have this kind of thing going on. And we see these head-on collisions and up and over injury patterns an awful lot. Maybe not so much anymore because cars are obnoxious if you're not wearing your seatbelt now. So a lot of the time people will be restrained. But we'll go back to talking about the airbag here for just a minute, because this is a better picture of it. What do you know about airbags? Anything? Nothing?
When they deploy, they generate a lot of force and they're pretty big. And
Yeah, it's a miniature explosion happening right in front of your face. They come out around 300 miles an hour or something ridiculous like that. And they tend to burn your forearms with the powder and the friction that comes out. They tend to cause maybe some facial injury, especially if your patient's not properly restrained or sitting too close to the steering wheel. If anybody remember all the way back to driver's ed when it was your hands at 10 and 2, right?
Yeah.
And now everybody drives with that single hand at noontime. You don't want to know what the recommendation is now is to have your hands at actually 9 and 3 on the steering wheel, because with your hands at 10 and 2 or with that single hand dead in the middle of the wheel, if an airbag deploys because you were involved in a collision, it will actually drive either one or both of your hands back into your face and cause now not only more head and facial injury, but also injuries to your hands, your wrists, and your arms. If you have your hands spread further out, driving like the bus driver, the airbag misses you. Next, we're talking about still head-on collision with a down and under injury pattern. These are the people who hit the dashboard, not the windshield. So we'll see a lot of hip fracture, hip dislocation, pelvis injuries because they probably weren't seated appropriately, weren't restrained appropriately. And when the car went in and hit, they slid downwards and their knees came forward and struck the dashboard. That's that energy transfer. We don't a lot of the time see necessarily real solid knee injury at that point. We'll see hips completely blown out of the socket or broken right out. We'll see pelvic fractures. We may see people that are completely rumpled and tucked underneath the dashboard. That's a pretty significant blow and a pretty significant shot. And then if you do wind up down in the floorboard like that, not only did your lower extremities hit, but as you're being dragged by that force of gravity propelling you, you're going to have some pretty significant facial trauma from hitting that same dashboard. If we look and talk about improperly worn lap belts a little bit, if a seatbelt isn't worn the way a seatbelt is meant to be worn, it is as good as not wearing one. It will cause more injury than it will ever prevent if your seatbelt's not on correctly. So shoulder restraint and lap belt positioned appropriately, it's supposed to grab onto bony prominences instead of going over the lower portion of your abdomen where things are a little more soft and squishy and don't really like that kind of pressure being applied to them. It will grab against the bones in your hip and the bones in your pelvis and keep you solid in the seat.
Question.
Sure.
How and who would deem a undeployed airbag safe?
So I don't really know the wheres and what fors and about actually doing it, but I know you guys are going to have a way to actually accomplish that. It used to be you could just cut, when airbags first came around, if the vehicle didn't have power, the airbag wouldn't deploy. So they would come and they would cut the positive negative terminals and there would be no more electricity, so there would be no airbag. Now airbags actually store a charge. So if there's no power, the airbag can still deploy if it has to. How it is made safe is not something I really know. I'll see if I can find something in between when we finish lecture and when you guys come in. But I know that the fire department is normally the folks that go ahead and take care of that.
Thank
you. Sure. So next we're talking about rear end collision and trying to predict mechanism of injury and injury patterns. Some rear end collisions have very predictable. That's our whiplash patient, you know, the patient who gets smoked from behind at a red light and has, you know, neck pain and back pain. And it's because when they were hit, they were sitting there minding their own business. They get propelled forward. Maybe their airbag deploys. Their head hits the airbag and arrests their forward momentum. But when they get rocked back in their seat, their neck actually hyperextends backwards a little bit because of the whipping effect of the vehicle's momentum. Improperly positioned headrests are going to be a big culprit for that. If your headrest is set up appropriately, your head just hits that and stops as opposed to getting cocked back and forth like a whip. And then we have these fun ones, rotational or rollover collisions. What do you think we can talk about for an injury pattern and things that we're likely to see with these kinds of crashes?
Head injuries.
Head injuries I like. Realistically, how about anything? Because every time that car hits something or is struck by something else, whether it's the ground, a tree, another vehicle, it's an all brand new collision. So every time that car tips over and comes crashing down again, new collision. So you have multiple more points of impact, you have multiple more points of injury possible. And then if any of you guys' cars look like mine, it looks like I'm homeless and live in my car. Every single thing in that vehicle in a rotational or rollover collision is turned into a projectile. So anything that's in there is going to be doing as much battering of the patient as the collision itself did. So this is difficult to predict because it's widespread. You know, this could be one of those where the person gets out of the vehicle and is injured not at all, or the person is still in the vehicle and they are smashed all to bits. It's just kind of a catch as catch can. So as we're evaluating our mechanism of injury, these are some things, and I know this comes directly from the text and is probably likely to be seen by you fellas again. When we talk about a significant or severe fall, these are our trigger points, right? An adult who fell more than 20 feet or a child who's under the age of 15 that's fallen either 10 feet or 2 to 3 times their height has been said to have a significant mechanism of injury. Because not everything is this big life-shattering injury, multiple system trauma. They're all going to be just, barely held together because they've been involved in such a traumatic event. Sometimes we'll show up and people will have called 911 for this single system trauma, was out playing in the driveway, I was playing with my kids. We were playing some little driveway hockey, and I hadn't been on my rollerblades in a long time, and now my wrist is bent in 3 brand new and fun and exciting spots. All right, well, that's not really a severe mechanism of injury. That's not really the most significant trauma you'll see in your life, because that was fall from a standing height. We have a single system trauma, simple fracture type situation. If that same person had said, well, I was putting shingles on the roof and or I was cleaning the gutters, that's another good one. I was cleaning the gutters and the ladder tipped, and next thing I know, 25 feet, but I landed on the ground, I feel okay. Negative, Ghost Rider. 20 feet or more, even with someone who's telling you they feel all right, it is way, way more likely that they have sustained a significant injury than they have gotten out of that one free. Kids, it's a little bit smaller of a height. And then when we start talking about pediatrics and mechanism of injury, let's talk about, brand new 22-inch newborn babies. A fall from something like a changing table is actually a significant fall with a severe mechanism of injury, because 2 times that is under 4 feet. 3 times that is just over 5 feet. So a fall from just something that doesn't really look altogether that significant can cause some pretty widespread and nasty little traumas in our pediatric patient. If we're evaluating a fall and we're trying to decide significant versus maybe not so much, we start to look at how high did they fall from, what did they fall onto, what part of the patient hit the ground first, and did anything interrupt that fall? Did anything slow them down on the way to the ground? There's a big difference between falling off a roof and landing in a pit full of pillows, and falling on the roof, off the roof, and landing in a pit full of bricks. It's just stuff to sort of keep in your back pocket, because it'll help you predict a little bit what could be injured, predict a little bit how badly they are injured. A lot of the times, especially if we're talking fall from height, the patient may not be responsive or may not be coherent just based on the amount of pain that they're in. So it's going to be difficult to get any real good kind of history from them. So always err on the side of this is significant until proven otherwise. It will help you treat your patients better, because we're always going to operate on the side of caution, as opposed to thinking, well, he said he's okay, we'll just get him to sign the refusal, and then the next thing you know, he's hemorrhaging internally, and you respond back to that same address in half an hour for cardiac arrest in progress. So always err on the side of caution and treat trauma aggressively. We're talking penetrating trauma here a little bit now, and injury pattern. Low velocity injuries are anything that is man powered. So knives, bats to a certain extent, things that aren't, driven by a handheld explosion. Generally, the area is limited to the area struck or the area poked. What I'll tell you about stab wounds is, if somebody disliked this person enough to stick them with a knife once up close and personal, they probably stuck them 101 times. So look for multiple stab wounds. Don't miss things like penetrating traumas that you didn't really necessarily look too close for. Don't get distracted by the obvious. When we start talking about firearms now, medium velocity is considered to be handgun and shotgun. Now this talks nothing at all about, you know, how big the projectile is, how big the slug leaving that handgun or shotgun happens to be. It's merely speaking about how fast that projectile leaves the business end of that weapon. When we talk high velocity, we start talking about rifles and things like that nature, and we can make our peace with the fact that the injury could be anywhere. Our medium velocity projectiles generally cause a permanent wound cavity. Maybe they hit something solid and bounce around in the body a little bit, but we don't see a lot of what that bottom word there, cavitation, is. Now, cavitation is, if you've ever seen any of those ballistics gel tests, and I'll play you guys a video of one to depict cavitation here in just a few minutes. But when you see a bullet in slow motion go through that ballistic gelatin, you actually see the path that the bullet's traveling, and then you see this big expanse of cavity around it as it's passing through that material. That's cavitation. Cavitation comes from more high-powered, high-velocity type weapons. And not only do we have that permanent wound cavity created by the bullet, we have a lot of tissue destruction and tissue damage surrounding it from that cavitation, that pressure wave of the bullet traveling through the person at a high rate of speed, really kind of just shredding, damaging, destroying, liquefying tissue on its way out. I'll show you that because the picture does it some pretty good justice. Moving on, we'll talk about blunt force trauma here for a second. Blunt force is a blow that strikes the body but does not penetrate the tissue. So we have internal stuff going on by whatever the blunt object was that was used or was responsible for causing this injury. And the one thing we know about things like that is if I don't have some form of open wound, I really can't see much. It takes a little while for bruising to show up. Bruises aren't something we always get to see right out of the gate. So when we're evaluating somebody who's involved in some form of blunt trauma, or during our scene size up, if we know we have been dispatched for something that will sort of trigger in our mind blunt trauma, start thinking about the things underneath this patient's skin that could be injured. We don't have x-ray vision. We don't have the ability to do CT and ultrasound on the side of the road. So we treat based on index of suspicion. We maintain that high probability that something underneath that I can't see is probably injured, and that injury will cause maybe internal bleeding, maybe abdominal contents to leak hazardous waste product into the abdominal cavity. If we're talking now a little further higher up in my abdominal quadrants, all of those solid organs contain a lot of blood, so we can see some internal hemorrhage and some signs and symptoms of shock. And we don't have to know why we have a patient who was involved in this blunt trauma. We don't really have to know why they're in shock. We just know patient A struck in the right upper quadrant by a motor vehicle, a train, a baseball bat, a golf club, whatever. And now they are showing me signs and symptoms of hypoperfusion, of hypovolemic shock. Hypo meaning low, volemic, volume of blood. So we start looking at that, and this is someone that we haven't even really laid hands on yet, because we are strictly evaluating what the scene is showing me. If I'm getting close to my patient and I'm seeing some things that make me concerned, it just adds to that index of suspicion, and it's going to help me treat based on mechanism, based on complaint, and probably do a really solid job for my patient. I told you this one was easier. Nature of illness. Why'd you call 911? I used to always, part of my scene size up in primary assessment was conversational, right? So how is it we came to meet today? What's going on? And the patient will tell me either exactly what the dispatcher told me, or the patient will tell me exactly what is going on and what they feel like and why I am standing there in their living room asking them all these questions. There's my patient's chief complaint. That's the reason that patient decided that they needed an ambulance, is whatever they tell you. You know, it may come over as a chest pain. Okay, fine. You show up in the patient's house and yeah, they say, yeah, I'm having some chest pain, but God, I'm really having this blinding headache and my face is all tingly on one side and I can't really move my arm. It's like, all right, well, yeah, you're having some chest pain, but it also sounds like you might be having a stroke. And the thing that the patient complained about most was the blinding headache and the tingling and numbness in their face and their inability to move that right arm at all. These things all fit together to give us the picture of what's going on. And we can get our information from absolutely anywhere. We can talk to the patient. We can talk to family, friends, bystanders. Look around the scene. If you walk into somebody's house and you can hear the oxygen concentrator going in the living room, and the place has yellow walls and a full ashtray in every room, and you got dispatched for shortness of breath, the scene is telling me that this patient is probably chronically short of breath, and now they have gotten profoundly sicker, and I need to get to the bottom of why and get about getting that fixed, or this patient is going to continue to deteriorate. And I still just walked in the front door. I see the nicotine stained walls. I hear the O2 concentrator, and I identify that there is a packed full ashtray of, you know, Camel no filters in every room, 2 + 2 being 4 in all. The scene is telling me what is going on. And then I start talking to my patient and I start talking to family and bystanders, and I'm painting myself a better picture. When we look at number of patients, that's really it. We just want to know how many and do I have the ability to care for this amount of people? If the answer to how many is more than 1 or 2, the answer to do I have enough people on hand for this is no, period. If the answer is, well, I have 1 really sick and 1 not so sick, you still don't have enough people on hand. So get on the radio sooner rather than later. The earlier in this whole thing that you request help, the more likely you are to get it in a timely fashion. If you wait until, holy buckets, I really need somebody right now, you're behind a little, and it's more likely that you're going to wind up not getting what you're asking for. Whether it's a paramedic, whether it's more fire personnel, whether it's police, whether it's technical rescue, hazardous materials, the power company, the gas company, it makes absolutely no difference at all. If you think you need it, you need it. And there's nobody on earth that has the ability to Monday morning quarterback that. The question shouldn't even be asked. Oh, I needed more resources. I needed a paramedic. I needed this. I needed that because, well, I needed it. At that given moment in time, I thought that was what was going to make this scene most successful. That's why I asked for it. Anybody have any questions about scene size up?
So Tommy, is the rule of thumb kind of like 1 to 1? So 1 provider to 1 patient, or is there any?
It should be, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, are there times that you can transport more than one patient? Sure. But those should be the exception, not the rule.
Okay, cool.
And especially, like I said, especially if one of those people is like super, super sick, you just can't do it. You're not an octopus. You don't have enough hands for that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So there's a lot of stuff that we talk about in that lecture. But on the bright side, most of those things are pretty common sense, right? As I'm approaching the scene, I'm going to evaluate my scene for safety. I'm going to make sure I put my proper BSI or PPE on, and I'm going to evaluate the scene to make sure there are no visible or obvious hazards. I'm going to now start to see how many patients I have. I'm going to evaluate my patient's mechanism of injury or nature of illness and decide if I need any additional resources. It's not that whole big all-encompassing thing that we just spent an hour plus talking about. It is pretty much step out of my ambulance, make sure nobody's going to start shooting at me, get my BSI, get my PPE on, start evaluating the scene. Do I notice anything that makes me start thinking, all right, there's more going on here than meets the eye? Do I see anything that points me towards we don't possibly have enough people on hand right now to take care of this? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, we can't do this, yes, we need more this, yes, we need more that, this is the time to make that decision and get out in front of all of that stuff. And then we start looking at what is actually going on. What is my patient's mechanism of injury? Do I see that overturned ladder? Do I see feet poking out from underneath a vehicle in the driveway? And I say, oh, well, there's my mechanism of injury. We got a patient pinned underneath a car because the jack collapsed because they were working on something they shouldn't have been. You know, it's pretty simple, like look and figure, look and figure, look and figure, constantly evaluating what it is that's happening and going on around you. And your scene size up is really from start to finish, because any new or different information that comes along that points you one way or the other on your scene size up still needs to be evaluated and still needs to be looked at and still sort of needs to be addressed so that the scene continues to operate and function. Because once these chaotic scenes turn into actual chaos and it really starts to look like a circus, it's difficult to reel that back in. So the best thing you can do is be regimented in the fact that, yes, I'm going to evaluate these things. I'm going to constantly evaluate these things. And the minute something screws up, I'm going to fix it. Any more questions?
Nope.
All right, that wasn't too awful confusing, right?
No.
All right,
No,
good.
that was pretty straightforward.
This next part's not really confusing either, which is, you know, a nice place to be on a Thursday after I've been beating you over the head with a textbook for the last 4 days. So we're gonna take a break. I have 9:43 on my watch, so keep clicking the mute button by mistake because, well, that's what I do. Why don't we say 16 minutes to make it an even 10 o'clock when we come back?
10 o'clock, heard.
All right, good deal. right, we're back. So we spent the first part of today talking about the things that are going to keep us safe on scene, evaluating the scene just a wee bit. Now we're going to talk about our patient. We have finally gotten to the point where we are going to start looking at our patient and beginning to evaluate any life threats. So one of the first things we're always going to look for as we're approaching our patient, now this is done from across the room, is do I see anything that to me would present a direct threat to this patient's existence? Things like external hemorrhage. You know, it takes somewhere in the neighborhood of about 90 seconds to bleed to death from an uncontrolled significant external hemorrhage. So if I don't stop and address that right out of the gate, by the time I'm done doing all the rest of this stuff, evaluating and treating airway, evaluating and treating breathing, evaluating and treating other things that go along with the patient's circulation, they will have already poured most of, if not all of, their circulating blood volume onto the ground. So we see here it says ABC. There's actually an X in front of that A, because the first thing we're looking for as a life threat is exsanguination. That is massive hemorrhage, meaning your patient has bled to death. Sure, our primary assessment may absolutely vary depending on patient's condition, other resources available on scene, absolutely. If my patient's airway or breathing is so tenuous and so messed up that I have to dedicate my entire existence at that moment in time to managing their airway with, you know, airway maneuvers, opening their airway, putting in some of the airway pieces or adjuncts that we worked with yesterday, or ventilating them with a BVM, I'm never going to get to check their circulation. I'm never going to get to do the rest of my assessment, because that's where I'm living. I am going to live at airway and breathing, and other people on scene, so my other resources, will be responsible for taking care of the rest of that stuff.
Excuse me, Tom.
Yo,
I don't know if it's just me, but I'm actually not seeing the slides. I'm just seeing the background of your computer. Oh, there we go.
I didn't click the right buttons.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. Thank you.
We should be good now. So additional resources on scene, other EMTs, other providers, we're all in this together. Now, as far as in the classroom goes, an assessment is a one-person show, because I need to know that you can actually perform the skills and do the things necessary to assess a patient. But when we get out into the road, like I said, depending on how sick this patient is and how much their airway, breathing, and circulation really involves your time, you may never get any further than that, and other people are gonna click in and take the rest of that load. Our primary assessment consists of forming our general impression. So that's as we're approaching, we're looking, is this patient seeing me as I approach? Are they responding to the fact that there is a perfect stranger in their living room walking towards them? Well, that would be a normal response to the current environment. If I'm approaching my patient and they are just sitting there sort of slouched on the couch and not paying any attention to what's going on around them, or the fact that there is a large human in their house, well, that's kind of a little bit more in the general impression side of, hey, this doesn't seem right. People don't normally behave this way. People don't normally respond this way. My general impression is really the first time I lay eyes on my patient. Haven't spoken to them, haven't touched them, haven't done a thing. But it's like, did they pass the sniff test, right? I'm looking at that person and I'm trying to decide, is this person doing what people are supposed to do? When I assess my mental status, you guys were already working on the beginning pieces of that when we started going through the initial portions of CPR. So that, hey, Larry, are you okay? And then going and pinching their trapezius muscle or giving them a little sternal rub. That's all part of our mental status assessment. Next thing, once I've gotten through that, I'm going to assess their airway. Airways need to be three things. Airways need to be open, clear, and secure. So sitting having a conversation, asking the patient some of those mental status questions that we're going to cover in a couple minutes is going to tell me if my patient is able to speak, guess what they have? An open, clear, and secure airway. Because people that are conscious and alert maintain their own airways. Normal muscle function, normal body function will keep a patient's airway open. If my patient is altered or unresponsive or doesn't really pass the whole mental status portion of this, I know that I'm probably going to have to do some things to make sure that their airway is open, clear, and secure. Maybe I have to do a head tilt chin lift. Maybe I have to do a jaw thrust. Maybe I have to put an oropharyngeal or an OPA or a nasopharyngeal or an NPA now to ensure that my airway has been maintained as open, clear, and secure. Because if I can't get gas from the outside to the inside, none of the rest of this stuff is going to work. If the airway is not open, gas doesn't get from the outside to the inside, gas doesn't do any exchanging, blood doesn't do any delivering, cells don't get any oxygen, cells don't get any oxygen, then we switch to that anaerobic metabolism and the whole system just goes into complete and total meltdown. Next, we move on to B. I'm going to assess my patient's breathing. When we assess breathing, we are looking for three things again: rate, rhythm, and quality. Now, I'm not really so much looking for a real solid number for their respiratory rate at this point in time. What I'm doing is getting my sort of quick down and dirty. Is that too fast? Is that too slow? Or is that just right? Rhythm, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Is it regular or irregular? Do they have like long periods of apnea where they're not breathing at all? Are they breathing real fast for a couple of seconds and then real slow for a couple of seconds? Breathing, when we do a breathing assessment, should be pretty unremarkable. It shouldn't look like anything funky. Quality, when we're assessing breathing quality, we're looking at chest rise and fall. We're looking to see, does that chest go up and down far enough for me to think that they are actually filling up those alveoli and making oxygen available for that concentration and that gas to exchange. The other part of assessing breathing is grabbing your stethoscope real quick and getting a quick set of lung sounds. Mid-clavicular above the breast on both sides, mid-clavicular below the breasts on both sides, mid-axillary just over the last rib. Because that's going to tell me, is my breathing noisy? I'm going to hear those crummy, adventitious lung sounds. I'm going to hear things that tell me, hey, this patient's breathing is kind of ruddy at best, and we need to do some things about fixing it. So here's where we get into a bit of the muddy water between what we're going to do in the field and what we're going to do here in class. In class, when you are performing an assessment on a patient, every single patient that you come into contact with here is going to receive high flow oxygen at 15 liters per minute with a non-rebreather mask, because that is what the state expects of you. So you're going to put oxygen on everyone, lots of oxygen, high flow O2, 15 liters per minute with a non-rebreather mask. When you get out and you're actually taking care of people, we're going to put oxygen on people that need it, because too much oxygen really is a negative. Too much oxygen is a thing, and too much oxygen will cause things like vascular constriction. You know, we talked about those smooth muscles yesterday that are around the outside of all of our vasculature. If we cause those to constrict, we make the size of our patient's tank smaller. So if my patient has a blockage in a coronary artery that is causing them a myocardial infarction, and then I go and make that artery smaller by giving them too much oxygen, what did I just do to their heart attack?
You
Made
made
it
a,
happen, made it happen faster.
I made it bigger. I absolutely made it happen faster. I absolutely made this patient worse by giving them something that for years we've been telling people, oh, some is good, more is better. Give them as much as you can. The same thing goes for strokes. If my patient has a blockage in a cerebral artery, and I now take and pour oxygen into them at a high rate of speed and a large volume, and I constrict that vasculature in their brain, I've made their stroke bigger. So in the street, you are really going to be responsible for giving oxygen only to people who need it. People that have some form of respiratory complaint, people that look like they're not breathing well. And we'll do it right here at this point of our assessment. If they seem like they need oxygen, they get oxygen. Breathing needs to be noiseless, effortless, and painless. If it's any one of those three things, we have to fix it. We have to do something. And then last but not least, we finally get down to assessing circulation. So if your patient is responsive and conscious, alert, and talking to you, we're going to check a radial pulse, because people that are conscious and alert don't really want us jamming our fingers in the side of their neck trying to take a carotid pulse. So, it's unpleasant. So we assess our circulation. We're looking for the same three things that we were when we were assessing their breathing: rate, rhythm, and quality. Too fast, too slow, just right, regular or irregular. And what does it feel like? Does it feel really weak where I'm checking it? Does it feel nice and strong? Does it do anything kind of wonky when I touch my patient's pulse? Does it make me think of something? Because when our heart beats, it's very, very just the same over and over and over again, somewhere between 60 and 100 times a minute on average for every patient. And then the final piece, we're going to determine our patient priority. Now, tell me, have we asked this patient any real questions? Have we really gotten into medically or traumatically what has been going on with this patient?
Not yet.
Not yet. So how do we already make our patient priority decision?
Based off your general impression and kind of how they look.
Yeah, and really anything that is a problem in our primary assessment is a direct threat to life. If my patient's brain is not functioning enough to keep them conscious, alert, and oriented, we've got some significant problems. If my patient can't maintain their own airway and I have to do it for them, we've got some problems. If my patient's got a respiratory status that is not well enough to just manage on its own, we've got some problems. And the same goes for circulation. When we assess circulation, we get that rate, rhythm, and quality. We're also going to check our patient's skin, color, temperature, and condition. I mentioned briefly that patients should be pink, warm, and dry. That is how I would be happy as a clam to see every single person I ever talked to in a medical fashion in my entire life. Because what that tells me is their circulatory status is good enough to actually supply blood out to the most distal portions of their body. Their heart is beating strong enough, their blood pressure is high enough that they are actually perfusing all points in between. So that tells me that their circulatory status is doing pretty well. A lot of times we'll see patients who are pale, cool, diaphoretic, cyanotic. And when we see those things, it tells me I have circulatory problems and or respiratory problems, and we need to start figuring those out, because any problem with the primary assessment is something you can consider a primary illness or injury, and it is something you need to fix right here during this primary assessment. Because all the other things that we can do, all the other assessment tools that we're going to use won't amount to a hill of beans if we don't properly assess and treat during the primary assessment, because these are direct life-threatening issues. Our general impression, we look around, we look at the patient's environment, we talk to the patient about their chief complaint, we look at the appearance of their surroundings, we look at the appearance of the patient, and it's going to start helping me build my case for sick versus not sick. Because my treatment sort of modality and my treatment priority will be a little different depending on, do I look at this patient and go, oh, holy crap, this guy's sick? Versus, well, I look at this patient and I go, well, they're sick enough to have called 911, so that's immediately concerning, but they don't look like they're trying to die right here in front of me. It's going to help me sort of adjust my care and transport priority. You know, there are times where you look at somebody and go, oh man, I hope they don't own any green bananas, because they'll never live to eat them. And we get to transporting very, very quickly. And then there's other times where we finish some of the finer points of our assessment and provide some treatment and see how the patient responds. And it's a much less high stress, lower priority type situation. Like I said, your general impression really is the look test, the sniff test. Take a look at Grandpa right here and tell me, is this how people normally do things?
Definitely not, unless he has some type of weird fetish.
Right. You know, he was walking along through his living room, minding his own business, and the next thing he knows, he just decided this seems like a good spot to lay down. I mean, if he was a dog, he'd turn around in a few small circles and that would be his spot. I get it. But this is a person. People don't generally just be like, well, this seems like as good a spot as any for a nap. This, to me, doesn't pass the whole general impression. Some actual little less physical type things, or things that we might need to think about a little bit more that indicate during the general impression portion, you know, is this how my patient should be reacting? Is this what my patient should be doing? Is, do they have an altered mental status? You know, when you first start your interaction with this patient, do they just respond to you normally? You know, are you just able to have a normal conversation? Well, we would call that patient alert. If I have to yell at my patient in order to get him to open his eyes or look at me or respond to me in any way, that means my patient is responsive to verbal stimulus. If my patient's not responding to verbal stimulus at any point, and I have to do something painful to him in order to elicit a response, that's when we determine our patient either responsive to painful stimuli if they do, or unresponsive if they don't. Right out of the gate, that flunks the general impression test, and that tells me I have to do some airway management. That tells me I have to do some probably breathing sort of treatment, and I should be concerned about their circulatory status. And if all of those things that are primary issues are starting to fall away by this patient, I know categorically that I am looking at a sick human. This is a sick patient, and my treatment transport priorities are, we need to get the hell out of here because I need to get this patient to where definitive care lives. Definitive care lives at the emergency room, where they have doctors and nurses just waiting for me to come barging through the doors and ruin their day. Some other things other than mental status are a patient who is super, super anxious. Someone who looks scared out of their wits because they don't want to die. Pale and sweaty skin. People shouldn't just be sitting in their living room sweating profusely. People should be pink, warm, and dry when they're just sitting there minding their own. We're going to talk about trauma for a minute. If we see any obvious signs of trauma to the head, chest, abdomen, or pelvis. Well, the head, that's pretty straightforward. The head is where the brain lives, and the brain is the computer that makes this whole thing tick. Why would obvious trauma to the chest be concerning?
That's where your most vital organs are.
Yeah, some of the most vital structures live in your thoracic cavity. Abdomen, it winds up on the list of importance because the abdomen can house a lot of freestanding blood from internal hemorrhage to the point where our patient could be bleeding to death internally without ever spilling a drop of blood on the ground. And the same goes for the pelvis. We'll get into some maybe specific positions that indicate distress. That's kind of, are they sitting in such a fashion that makes it so that they can breathe easier? Or are they so uncomfortable that they have to have their knees drawn up to their chest so that their abdomen doesn't hurt quite as badly? You start to just look at, how is this person behaving? And is this a way that humans normally do things? Is a lot of your general impression. If we find a patient who appears lifeless, so unresponsive, doesn't look like they're breathing, maybe we can't find a carotid or a radial pulse, we want to start that station 1 cardiac arrest management right away, get our AED going as soon as possible, and manage our cardiac arrest. We're looking for age, sex, and how we found them. We're going to listen to see if we hear anything. If we hear moaning, well, we at least know that they're not dead. If we hear snoring, that's one of the airway noises that we're going to be able to correct. What airway piece that we talked about and worked with, I think yesterday, the days are starting to run together already. What airway piece of equipment is going to correct our snoring respirations?
OPA.
The OPA, yeah, its job is to pull the tongue forward and get it out of the back of the airway. And when we do that, we shouldn't hear any more snoring after we've put our OPA in. What about gurgling? What do you think gurgling is going to tell us about my patient's airway and breathing?
Probably obstructed by some type of fluid.
Obstructed by some type of fluid. I like it. We have some equipment that can fix that as well. We hear gurgling when we're doing our general impression airway breathing assessment. We're going to introduce some suction. We have portable suction that we can use to vacuum out all of that fluid from inside our patient's airway. And we should be able to correct that gurgling because the lungs don't want that stuff down there anyway. So if we can't clear that airway, or the patient can't clear it on their own, we get out our suction, we take care of whatever fluid it is that's in there, get that gurgling to stop, and now we have an airway that is open because we used an OPA, we used an NPA, we've cleared it, and now we can call it secure. And this is all just by listening and hearing something. As far as smell goes, this has always been one of my least favorite of the senses that we're going to use to figure out how sick somebody is. Do we smell urine or feces or vomit, or are we starting to smell some actual tissue decay or decay of a person who may or may not be salvageable at that point, depending on, is it just sort of necrosis of a tissue or necrosis of a person? Because people that have been dead long enough for decay to have started don't get resuscitated. But if we have sort of gangrenous toes or feet or something like that, you may still smell some decay. You may smell some stink coming from whatever that wound is. We talked about chief complaint when we were doing our scene size up. We'll talk about it again here. Our patient may give us something that is absolutely lights out specific. They may tell us exactly everything we need to hear about why they called 911 and what is bothering them the most. And then they may tell us absolutely nothing. I just don't feel well. I haven't been feeling like myself. I'm tired. All right, none of those things point me anywhere. But that's chiefly what's wrong with this patient. They are telling me this is what is bothering me the most. So this is our AVPU scale. I went through this just a minute ago. If my patient is alert, they're speaking to me, they're able to hold down their end of the conversation. When we talked about patient refusal, there were 4 questions I had to ask to make sure that my patient was oriented. This is the point where I'm going to ask those questions. If my patient's alert and can talk to me, I'm going to ask them, do they know who they are? Do they know where they are? Do they know roundabout what time it is? And can they tell me what's going on? If my patient is alert and talking to me and able to answer my questions and he answers all 4 of those correctly, we will call them conscious, alert, and oriented times 4. If my patient gets any of those questions wrong, we subtract 1 for every question they get wrong. Conscious, alert, and oriented times 3, 2, 1, or 0, we would call them disoriented or altered. Maybe they're alert, they're looking around, they're saying something when I ask them a question, but it's not something that makes any sense. And then we start moving our way through verbal, painful, and then finally unresponsive. Verbal means I had to yell at them to get their attention or get them to open their eyes or respond to me. Painful means I had to do something hurtful or uncomfortable to get them to respond to me. And when all of that fails, we call our patient unresponsive. So if our airway is in danger of any problem with its openness, clearness, or secureness, we have to respond to that. If the airway is in danger, the patient is in danger. We have to take our steps to make sure that it is open, clear, and secure. Right here is the suction that we'll see later on today when you guys come in. If my patient has, or I suspect that they have had any traumatic event, I'm going to use a jaw thrust. If my patient has not received any trauma, and I have no reason to think that they have, we'll use the head tilt chin lift because we don't have to worry about their cervical spine. Trauma patients, we use the jaw thrust because it maintains the head in a neutral position. The head tilt chin lift, we actually hyperextend the neck a little bit to get that airway open. So that's why with traumatic patients, we don't want to do that because we can cause some pretty significant neurological problems up to and including paralysis or dead. So the jaw thrust is always what we're going to use to open the airway of a trauma patient. And our head tilt chin lift can be used for our medical patients. We may actually ventilate people who are breathing on their own. The BVM is not just meant for people that are in cardiac arrest. The BVM is not always just meant for people who are in respiratory arrest. Respiratory arrest means they have stopped breathing altogether. You can ventilate people whose breathing is just not adequate. So someone whose respiratory status during our breathing assessment has gotten so bad that their body is not being supplied appropriately, we need to supply for them. One of the things that is a great example of that is a heroin overdose. Heroin goes in, turns out all the lights, starts to really slow down all of the body processes by turning off the central nervous system and hindering its ability to work and respond and do the things that it's supposed to. When it does that, we'll find somebody who's overdosed on an opiate who maybe is breathing 4 times a minute. Does that sound like enough? It's 1 breath every 15 seconds.
Definitely not.
Yeah. So we'll actually use a BVM to ventilate that patient long before we ever reach for any Narcan, because if they're not breathing adequately, until I reverse this, the very last word on this page, the hypoxia, hypoxia, low oxygen in the blood, any of the other stuff that I can do isn't really going to help. Not to mention the fact that the brain is becoming hypoxic because it's not getting enough oxygen. So we really start to ventilate people even though they may be breathing on their own. So our circulation, we went through this already a little bit as well. We're going to assess our patient's pulse, checking for rate, rhythm, and quality. Responsive patients, most of the time, we're just going to check a radial pulse. Unresponsive patients, we're going to check a carotid and a radial pulse, because it takes different amounts of blood pressure to actually cause pulses in different areas of the body. In order to have a carotid pulse, you need to have a blood pressure of somewhere around 70. In order to have a radial pulse, you need to have a blood pressure of somewhere around 100. So if I reach down and I go to feel my patient's radial pulse and they don't have one, but I reach up and I feel a pretty decent carotid pulse, what does that tell me about my patient's blood pressure? High, low, or just right?
Sorry, could you
Low?
repeat?
So Pat, I think you were asking me to repeat it. So I reach down and I go to try and find a radial pulse, and I can't find one. But I reach up and I can feel a carotid pulse on my unresponsive patient.
So it's low.
It's low, yeah, because there's not enough pressure in the system to push the blood out that far, and that's why they don't have a radial pulse. So it tells me right then and there my patient is hypotensive, hypo, low, tension, blood pressure. So if I can, right out of the gate during my primary assessment, verify that my patient is for sure hypotensive, I know that they have a circulatory issue. Don't have any idea what it is, may never have any idea what it is, but I found it. And one of the best things I can do for this patient is oxygenate them, keep them warm, and transport them to somewhere who can fix the problem. Because as EMS providers, we don't do a lot of fixing. We don't do a lot of making their problem go away. We do a lot of delaying and making their problem better for right now so that we can get them to definitive care, because our end goal is always, we need to get towards the hospital. We need to get moving. We need to get moving. Yes, we can do all of our assessment. We can do all of our treatment right there in the living room, or we can do all of our assessment and all of our treatment right there in the back of the ambulance on the way. But definitive care is the end goal.
So quick question on that. So if you have a patient that's unresponsive and they don't have a radial pulse, but you can find the carotid, do you stop CPR the second that you can find any pulse? Or if they still don't have that radial or any kind of distal pulse, do you continue with CPR?
So if you find a pulse at any point, they're no longer in cardiac arrest. You will probably, if for whatever reason you get pulses back, even if it's just a carotid, yes, it means their blood pressure is low, but it also means that they are starting to circulate blood on their own. And it's quite likely that you have done some compressions while their heart was beating already. And that's not a huge concern, because we're priming the pump at that point. We are helping restore pressure. If you've already done some CPR, you've already done the rib damage, right? So a couple of compressions while they have a pulse isn't going to hurt them. But if you find one or notice that the patient's starting to move or their eyes are starting to flutter or something like that, you can stop compressions.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So assessing skin color, temperature, and condition is part of our circulatory assessment, and that is going to be super important, because it's going to start pointing us into the direction of the rest of our assessment and how sick this patient is. We're going to try and start looking at skin color, temperature, and condition all the time, because anything that's not pink, warm, and dry is clinically significant. We'll get into all the whys of it being clinically significant in due time. But just know that it is. If someone is not pink, warm, and dry, we've got problems, and it could be significant ones, and it could be widespread. And then we have another small bleeding assessment here. So I'm going to go back to Grandpa laying on the floor. When we find a patient in this fashion, especially laying on a rug, still fully clothed, it is entirely possible that that rug and all of his clothing are going to hide our ability to see any blood at all coming out of him, or at least mask the amount of blood he is losing. The second check for gross hemorrhage and significant bleeding that we're going to do is something I like to call the sticky test. You take your hands and you just slide them underneath your patient, underneath the head, pull them out, we look at them. Do I have anything wet and sticky on me? Nope. All right, I move down behind the torso. Slide your hands just under your patient, pull them out. Do I have anything wet and sticky on me? Yes or no? If you find during this sticky test, when you're assessing circulation, that you are covered in large amounts of wet and sticky and not belonging to you, it's time to figure out where that blood is coming from. So we would do what we had to do to move this patient and find where that leak was coming from, because finding that much blood hidden underneath your patient should generally tell you that they have a pretty significant hemorrhage going on somewhere, and we need to find it and we need to patch it. So now let's talk about determining our patient priority for a few minutes. You notice this first thing that talks about a patient being stable, talks about vital signs being in normal range, but we haven't actually physically measured any vital signs. Nowhere in this lecture yet have we talked about taking out a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope and actually physically checking our patient's blood pressure. So how at this point are we determining that our patient's blood pressure is normal?
What is
Does
it, just
anybody-
by palp?
Say it again?
Just by palp?
So yeah, if you remember back to when we first started talking about vital signs, I told you the big three that were sort of the most important ones that we were for sure going to do on everyone. Heart rate, respiratory rate, and blood pressure. So we opened the airway, we made sure the airway was open, clear, and secure. We assessed our patient's breathing for rate, rhythm, and quality. And we found either too fast, too slow, or just right. We assessed our patient's circulation for rate, rhythm, and quality. We found either too fast, too slow, or just right. So if my patient's airway is good, his mental status is good, his respiratory rate isn't too fast or too slow, it's just right, the rhythm and the quality are all in order, my patient's circulation, rate, rhythm, and quality are all in order, that tells me that my respiratory rate is within normal range, my heart rate is probably within normal range, and my blood pressure is probably within normal range. I haven't actually physically really measured them, but first glance, if I'm going to call this patient stable, all three of those things need to be a check mark in the positive column. Airway, breathing, and circulation cannot be under attack and us call a patient stable. So if you have had to manage a problem with mental status, airway, breathing, or circulation, or your patient flunks your general impression, they are automatically an unstable patient, a sick patient, until proven otherwise. If your patient can't really be called stable, can't really be called unstable, always err on the side of this patient has the potential to be unstable. Because I can't really right at this very given moment say that they're super sick, but I also can't say that they're not. So they have the potential to go either way. always, always, always look for, look at, and treat for worst case scenario. We don't have the ability to run labs on the side of the road. We don't have X-ray, CT, MRI, ultrasound available to us on the side of the road. We don't have any of the other diagnostic tools available that they do with the hospital. So our job is to assess and treat the things that we find. Who knows at the end of the day whether the aspirin that we gave this patient who was complaining about chest pain, who knows whether they were actually having a heart attack or not. But we know that if they're having chest pain, I need to do X, Y, and Z to make sure that I am adequately caring for worst case scenario. And adequately caring for worst case scenario is a threat to your ABCs or any of your primary assessment not only needs to be fixed right now, but it also makes your patient unstable. When we're going to talk about our transport decision here in class, all of the patients that we're going to present to you and all of the assessments that you're going to do are going to be high priority transports to the closest appropriate facility with an ALS intercept en route. Every single one of them. Because you have to know how to take care of sick people and have to know how to decide whether somebody is sick or not before we can start talking about people that aren't altogether that sick and maybe really don't require a whole bunch of intervention from us, just transport to the emergency room. But everybody here, we're going to start thinking of when I assess my patient's breathing, I'm going to apply oxygen 15 liters per minute with a non-rebreather mask. And when we look for circulation, we want to start remembering skin color, temperature, and condition. One of the most important things you can check for in your primary assessment. And then the last piece of your primary assessment here in class is going to be my patient is a high priority transport to the closest appropriate facility with an ALS intercept en route. And these two lectures, the scene size up, so your scene safety BSI and your general impression, mental status, airway, breathing, circulation, and transport decision are pretty much where almost all of the critical criteria that you're going to be graded on at the state level lives on your state exam practical sheet. If you don't get good habits right now with assessing your patient's primary assessment and your scene size up, breaking those habits is going to be tough when it comes time to actually go and perform for the state. So we're going to go through this a lot. We're going to do a lot of patient assessment over the next month, month and a half. And you guys will start saying these words in your sleep. It's going to become second nature, because in order to be a good EMT, you have to be good at assessing a patient, because we perform an assessment on every single patient, on every single person we come into contact with when we step out of our ambulance, period. It's just what we do.